Welcome, everyone, to this press conference with the Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in the Palestinian Territory occupied since 1967, Mr. Michael Lynk. We will start with some short introductory remarks from Mr. Lynk, and then we'll move on to questions from you all after that. And as I understand, the Special Rapporteur has an engagement immediately following this. We'll try to wrap this up at around 12:40, 12:45, something like that.
1:40 or 1:45.
Yes, sorry, that's correct.
Good afternoon to the members of the press and the media who are present here this afternoon. My thanks for your attendance. My name is Michael Lynk, and I have served as the Special Rapporteur for the situation of human rights in the occupied Palestinian Territory occupied since 1967. I was appointed by the Human Rights Council in March 2016. In my role as Special Rapporteur, I am an independent human rights expert and part of the special mandates procedures of the Human Rights Council. I do not speak on behalf of the United Nations, but I do speak to the United Nations and to the international community. Yesterday, I delivered my latest report to the Third Committee of the United Nations General Assembly here in New York. The primary focus of my report deals with the prevalence of impunity and the lack of accountability in Israel's 52-year-old conduct of its occupation of the Palestinian Territory. My report calls upon Israel to completely end its illegal occupation, end its unlawful annexation of East Jerusalem, and unwind its illegal settlement enterprise. But I acknowledge that these kinds of requests to Israel by myself and others have gone almost entirely unheeded for decades now. Therefore, my report directs the bulk of its attention on the legal and the political responsibilities of the international community to decisively intervene to end the occupation and remove the barriers to the fulfillment of self-determination for the Palestinians. It is the international community that has long promised to hold Israel to account for its unwillingness to end the occupation, and it is the international community that alone can insert the key of accountability to unlock the titanium cage that is the endless occupation. To date, while the international community has issued numerous resolutions and declarations critical of the Israeli occupation and its steady designs for annexation, these criticisms have been rarely matched by any meaningful consequences. In a comment that aptly applies to the wider world, Miguel Moratinos, the former European Special Representative for the Middle East, once said with respect to the Israeli occupation, quote, "We Europeans excel at declarations. It compensates for our scarcity of action," unquote. The international community has a wide menu of countermeasures at its disposal to require that deficient states end their serious violations of humanitarian and human rights law. The international community of the Red Cross has developed a useful starting point for measures that can be taken. Some of these are addressed in my report. In my view, a productive starting point for the international community is for them to step up to the plate with respect to two important accountability steps. First, a complete ban on all goods and services produced in whole or in part from the illegal Israeli settlements in the West Bank and East Jerusalem from entering the international market. This would fulfill the binding legal obligation on the international community not to assist and not to aid in the growth or development of the economy of the illegal settlements. It would also impair the financial viability of these settlements. And secondly, I'm calling for the release in the very near future by the United Nations of the database on business and economic activity in the Israeli settlements that it has been working on since 2016. This database should be released in a fully transparent fashion with all businesses named, and it would be satisfactorily resourced and funded into the future so that it can become a dynamic tool to sufficiently monitor ongoing business activity in the settlements. Such a database could also serve as a template for similar databases in other human rights conflict zones. Thank you very much, and I'm happy to take questions from you.
Let's see. First up, I see for the United Nations Correspondents Association. Go ahead, Evelyn.
Thank you, Mr. Lynks. And I'm Evelyn Leopold, and on behalf of the UN Correspondents Association. We appreciate your briefing. My question is, what other intervention do you suggest from the international community? This is truly a small part of the problem on isolating the settlements. And secondly, you're obviously a bit familiar with the Kushner plan. Is this going to come about? Is this going to help? Is this going to hinder?
Thank you for those questions. On your first question with respect to the menu of countermeasures that can be taken by the international community, keep in mind that there is a very rich history in the United Nations and in other international institutions such as the European Union that have imposed sanctions, countermeasures, boycotts, and other forms of diplomatic and political measures. One only has to think what happened 5 years ago when a member of the permanent member of the Security Council invaded another country and annexed part of its territory, how swift the European Union was to impose trade and investment and political sanctions on that country for its occupation and its illegal annexation. One only has to look at a respected organization like the International Committee of the Red Cross, which has laid out a number of commonly used countermeasures that have been applied in recent history. Some of the matters are discussed and listed in my report. I'll just give you an example of a few that I think should be eventually thought of by the international community. If these mild measures, and I agree with you, these mild measures with respect to the release of the database and the complete boycott on goods and services coming from the illegal Israeli settlements is not enough to reverse the occupation. I would include measures such as a refusal to ratify agreements that have already been signed between Israel and the European Union or individual countries in the European Union or elsewhere. Adopting lawful countermeasures such as arms embargoes or reductions in arms trade, to think of whether or not there needs to be trade and financial restrictions, or the reduction or suspension of aid and cooperation agreements. I would look at whether or not the United Nations General Assembly should think of wanting to put an advisory opinion to the International Court of Justice with respect to the ongoing legality of the occupation, and also what are the legal responsibilities of the international community to bring a wrongful human rights situation to a complete end. There are also issues with respect to putting travel bans on people who are part of issues of human rights violations, including, in particular, the settlements. It's well laid out in the Statute of Rome of 1998 with respect to that civilian settlements in occupied territory amount to a war crime, and those who are directly or indirectly involved in the perpetuation of those illegal settlements may well have travel bans or warrants waiting for them as well. So there's a wealth of countermeasures that can be considered by the international community. I'm urging it to start at a low basis and to see whether or not that draws enough of Israel's attention to stop the expansion of the settlements and to reverse its occupation. You've mentioned the second question you asked of me has to do with the Kushner plan. I have no more knowledge than the rest of the international community and certainly the international press with respect to the details of the Kushner plan. We've been waiting it for so long, I wonder if this is a play by Samuel Beckett with regards to this. I would think that certainly from my conversations with people who pay close attention to the Israeli occupation of Palestine, that there seems to be a very low expectation that it would have much meaningful impact on the ground if and when it ever winds up getting released. I have put out a press release back in June, I believe, to say that any peace plan that's issued that doesn't follow the international consensus and international law with respect to the occupation should not be highly regarded by the international community. We'll have to wait and see whether or not what it proposes matches what the consensus and international law winds up saying.
Thank you. It was my way of bringing up the United States, which you did not mention, and I don't see how any of this can operate without some kind of role for the United States.
I hear you on that, but the United States does play an important role in the world and generally, and with respect to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict specifically. But there are lots of other measures that other countries can wind up taking, either within their own institutions, such as the European Union, or individually. Ireland, as one example, is considering in its own parliament a bill that would ban settlement goods coming from any occupied territory where there have been civilian settlement of by the occupying power in that occupied territory. I think that's a good first step from an individual country's basis that could serve as a template for other countries. Sweden has announced that it recognizes the state of Palestine. So there are individual actions that may well grow into cluster actions if enough other countries decide to join. And this doesn't need to be always led by one permanent member of the Security Council.
Okay, I see questions. I see Ibtisam first, then I see Abdelhamid and Masood finally. So go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you for the briefing. My name is Ibtisam Azim from Al Arab Al Jadid newspaper. I have two questions. The first one regarding the UN itself and specifically the Secretary General. Which role, regarding the measures you talked about, which role or steps you think he should take or maybe be more vocal on this issue or the issues you mentioned? And the second one, I'm not sure if you can talk to the issue of Palestinian prisoners and human rights violations there regarding minors and also detention centers. Thank you. Okay.
On your first question, I would actually look broader than the Secretary General with respect to this. I recognize that there are institutional roadblocks at the Security Council that sometimes have impeded taking more decisive steps with respect to Middle East peace. In those sorts of cases, I look then to the other two main bodies of the United Nations, the General Assembly and the Human Rights Council, who've both performed, I think, over the last couple of years, some invaluable work in trying to advance the question of trying to find peace and security for Israelis and Palestinians and ensuring a shared future for both of them. Why couldn't the General Assembly adopt a resolution with respect to asking the International Court of Justice for an advisory opinion on the legality, the continued legality or illegality of the occupation, and what are the responsibilities of third states to bring a human rights situation to a successful completion? They did that in 2003 when they asked the International Court of Justice for an advisory opinion on the location and permanence of the Israeli separation wall. And that was successful, and we got a very good decision from the International Court of Justice. 15 years later, I think it's past time to be able to put another important question to the ICJ to be able to ask on that. So that's where I would think those who want to be able to move the needle forward on Israeli-Palestinian peace would want to look for within the forums of the United Nations. Your second question has to do with Israeli prisoners. Of course, that's an issue my apologies, Palestinian prisoners. That is a question, of course, that I pay close attention to as the Special Rapporteur. I have written regularly with respect to the high number of Palestinian prisoners in Israeli jails who are there either for crimes with very lengthy sentences that seem to exceed what the international standards would wind up calling for, with respect to the use and abuse of administrative detention, and particularly with the imprisonment of minors. And my understanding is that there are something in the range of 30 to 60 Palestinian children at any one time who are being kept by the Israeli government for alleged crimes or throwing of rocks or other forms of disobedience they've been involved in. This should not happen. There are very strict guidelines with respect to the imprisonment of children, and it should only be used as a last resort. I also want to take this opportunity to answer your question, to comment critically on the Israeli government's raid several weeks ago on the Palestinian Prisoner Association Ademir, which I believe is in Ramallah, and the ransacking of their office, the taking of a lot of their vital documents, which seems only to be able to hamper their very legitimate operations in terms of advocating for Palestinian political prisoners. This is, I think, indicative of a wider problem of shrinking space for Israeli and for Palestinian human rights organizations together as the occupation continues to get deeper and more embedded.
Go ahead, Abdul Hamid.
Thank you. My name is Abdul Hamid Sayama from the Arabic daily Al-Quds Al-Arabi, that is based in London. Thank you, Mr. Lynk, for this press conference. And I have a number of questions, but I'll start with what you mentioned in your report about the obligations of any member state when they join the UN. Do you think there is enough argument now that some member of state can challenge the legality of Israel being a member of the United Nations because it had been in violation of every kind of international law, including the obligations as a member state? Second question, I also want to see if your opinion about if there is enough legal argument to take Israel to the ICC based on the international reports that came out in, like the report of Mr. Goldstone and Mohammed Shabazz and Desmond Tutu in 2006 about Beit Hanun. There are so many reports that bring Israel to the point where they are committing war crimes and crimes against humanity. Would that be enough to take Israel to the ICC? Thank you.
Thank you for those questions. With respect to the first question, one of the areas that I examine in some depth in my report that was released yesterday has to do with Article 25 of the Charter of the United Nations. And for those of you who aren't familiar with it, it's a very simple clause. It says that the members of the United Nations agree to accept and to carry out the decisions of the Security Council in accordance with the present Charter. So this means not that every resolution of the Security Council is a decision, but some resolutions are decisions. And in my view, any decision, any resolution of the Security Council which actually pronounces on the legality of a particular situation is a decision of the Security Council and therefore must be obeyed by that member. I'd be the sort of person who would say expelling a member from the United Nations would be a very last resort. And we've only ever done that once to my knowledge, and that was apartheid South Africa back in the 1960s. Much better to keep an offending member within the circle, but begin to use the kind of persuasion and or pressure and or countermeasures that would wind up bringing that member out of its defiant mood and back into compliance with international law, international consensus, and with its obligations with respect to that. But I think that we can point to probably 30 or 35 resolutions of the Security Council since 1967 that Israel is in breach of, many of them demanding that Israel obey international law, particularly with the settlements, particularly with the annexation of East Jerusalem, that the international community has to be serious, that if it's going to expect worldwide respect for its own decisions and to expect public legitimacy for the work that it winds up doing, has to ensure that there is a form of accountability. Any legal system, domestic or international, that does not take actions, positive actions, to ensure compliance with the decisions that it makes and that every member winds up agreeing that it will comply with, winds up eroding the respect for that institution. So it's in the best interest of the international community, the best interest of the United Nations, that it starts taking steps to ensure compliance with, among other things, Article 25. With respect to your second question on the International Criminal Court, as you know, there already are complaints filed by the State of Palestine since 2015, I believe, with the International Criminal Court. It's still in the stage of conducting its preliminary investigations. As I understand it, there are two main complaints before the International Criminal Court and the Special Prosecutor. One has to do with the conduct of Israel during the 2014 war involving Gaza, and the second has to do with the Israeli settlements. In many ways, I think the Israeli settlements ought to be a very easy question for the International Criminal Court to decide to progress to the next stage of its investigation, ultimately hoping to reach the court itself. I am not sure why there's been such a delay. I understand from the special prosecutor in her report in December 2018, her last annual report, that she thought that the preliminary investigation is going to be wrapped up relatively quickly in 2019. Here we are in late October. We still have not heard word with respect to that. So it remains my hope, and it remains the hope of those who believe in international law, that the two main areas of accountability that presently exist, the International Criminal Court complaints and this prospect of a database on business activity in the occupied territory, both of them will come to fruition sometime in the next 4 to 6 months, and that will aid in establishing accountability and hopefully begin to unwind the occupation.
Let's see. I see Masood has a question. Also NHK, I believe, has a question. If we can take both questions at the same time, and then we'll get a response, because we can running a tiny little bit short on time. Is that okay? Go ahead, Masood.
Yeah, my name is Masood. I represent Dawn of Pakistan. There are, in reference to all the questions and so on and so forth, there are people who are saying that since Israel was created in 1948 by a decree of the United Nations, there are cynics who say that the United Nations job is done, it should be folded up and finished. That is how it is. There's no amount of resolution that have been passed, as you yourself said, no amount of caveats, no amount of warnings to Israel have been able to move Israel moving towards some sort of settlement, something. No, it has not happened. It is not. Do you think there are still hopes? Do you think there is still hope that Israel can come to some sort of understanding with the Palestinian people?
Okay.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. My name is Sato from NHK. So, according to your statement and remark, the Israel government rejected a special rapporteur to get access into the occupied area. So, what did the Israel side explain to the special rapporteur, the reason and the cause of the not letting access into the occupied area?
Okay, I'll answer those questions backwards if I can. The first question with respect to my access. I have been a special rapporteur now for 3.5 years. Every spring, I write to the Israeli mission, permanent mission in Geneva, asking for permission to visit the occupied Palestinian Territory and Israel, and I get no response. Crickets, silence. I don't take it personally in the sense that my prior two predecessors as special rapporteurs, neither of them were allowed in either. There hasn't been a special rapporteur for this mandate who's been able to enter Israel since John Dugard did in the end of his mandate in 2008. I constantly plea every time I make a report to either the Human Rights Council or the General Assembly, saying that this is in violation of the procedures and protocol with respect to the United Nations. I also say that it would greatly aid my work if A, I was able to see what's going on the ground, and B, if I was able to have constructive exchanges with the government of Israel. I think that would probably increase my understanding of their perspective on various issues. Be that as it may, my plan B is to go to Amman, Jordan every year. I meet with human rights defenders from Palestine and Israel who come across the river to meet with me. I meet with UN officials from Jerusalem and Ramallah and Gaza. I meet with officials from the Palestinian Authority as well. But you also have to remember that the Israel-Palestine conflict is probably one of the best documented conflicts in the modern world. There are a number of top-drawer Israeli and Palestinian and regional and international human rights organizations that produce superb reports and superb advocacy on the question of what is going on. So I actually have, as my plan B, a wealth printed knowledge in front of me that I can wind up working with, and I do work with, and it helps to shape my thinking, and it helps to shape the reports and the statements that I wind up issuing. Nothing substitutes for being there, but if I can't be there, this is a workable substitute in my mind. With respect to the other question, Israel was created in 1948 by a decision of the United Nations, and if I got the gist of the question correctly, it is shouldn't this issue sort of be put to bed, if I understood it. The resolution passed in November 1947 called for two states, a Jewish state and a Palestinian state. One state came into being and the other state did not. In fact, in some ways, we're not talking about a two-state solution. We're talking about a second-state solution as a possible end goal. The world community has accepted that the question of Palestine remains an obligation of the community to deal with and resolve until there finally is a Palestinian state of some sort or another. You know, and you think there's probably hasn't been an international conflict where the world is so knowledgeable of what's going on the ground, it's so attuned to the fact that the occupying power is steadily creating facts on the ground to try to forestall any semblance of Palestinian sovereignty ever occurring. It is so well informed by all of these briefings from UN officials and from civil society organizations, yet the world is so unwilling to want to take the steps to fulfill the responsibility it itself has said that it has to bring a successful resolution to the question of Palestine. So as long as there remain 5 million Palestinian refugees, as long as there remains no Palestinian state, as long as there remains an occupation that operates in defiance of all the foundational rules of the laws of occupation, there will continue to be world interest and a burning international responsibility to deal with this, not to manage it, but to bring it to an end. And I sadly say that I don't foresee that happening within the remaining 2.5 years of my mandate. But what I want to use the remaining years, the 2.5 years of my mandate, is to raise and raise again the issue of accountability so that the international community will wind up accepting the steps that it has to do. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks, everyone, for coming, and we hope to see you back again tomorrow at 1 o'clock for the next press conference, which will be with the Special Rapporteur on extrajudicial summary or arbitrary executions, Ms. Agnès Calamard. That's 1 o'clock tomorrow. Thank you.